Okay. Assalamualaikum
Waalaikumsalam.
warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, everyone. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to deliver or present my a part of my thesis, actually, to the Center of the Islamic Studies and Civilization. And thank you, Dr. Charuh, Dr. Hakan, thank you. And also,
You're welcome.
thank you. And also, please allow me from before asking you for delivering my speech. Okay, as already introduced, I'm PhD candidate. Actually, it's not yet a doctor because my university has not awarded me yet.
I
And
see.
I'm still
I see. Officially, you are not yet,
still
but hopefully.
revising.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm still revising my thesis for after I submitted, then it turned back to me, and then I have to revise something because there's a minor revision on it. And then I'll submit maybe later on. Then they will officially award me as a PhD from Western Sydney University. Okay, to shorten my presentation. Okay, I will talk about risks of Islamic banking and finance. So there are many skeptical views about Islamic banking, especially in Indonesia, because Indonesia is a country where the first bank was established is not Islamic bank, but conventional bank. So people mind in the mindset of the people of Indonesia, they know the bank is actually conventional bank type system, not Islamic bank type of system. So that's why they thought that what is the difference of the cost between Islamic and conventional banks? Because they are roughly similar, they said like that. And actually, Islamic bank and finance is associated with the ethical business. Yeah. So everything which is in Islam, we are not allowed to sell the pork and then something such as what they call alcohol, things like that. And due to these things, they have to comply with Sharia. The Islamic bank have to comply with Sharia, which raise a unique risk for the Islamic banking and finance in Indonesia. And then now I'm going to explain a little bit about the term, what is interest and what is riba. Actually, free of interest means here is free of interest rate from the bank, not all riba. So in Islamic bank, they have to be free from interest. They have to be free from the gharar or ambiguity. They have to be free from the speculation and gambling. They have to be also free from the falsehood or the batil. So this is also, as mentioned in the Quran, the purpose of the Islamic banking actually is to help the people from their hardship. So if they are in need of money, they can actually take a financing from the Islamic bank. Then if the Islamic bank, if they are unable to cover at the later, maybe their business is just suddenly collapse, they can then ask for Islamic bank to give them a charity. Actually, it is the true of the purpose of it. But let's see what is happening. So this is my critique about the Islamic banking, and later on I will explain it. Actually, in Indonesia, there are 3 Islamic organizations which are very big Islamic organization. The first one is Muhammadiyah. It is one of the biggest. And the second one is NU or Nahdlatul Ulama. It is the biggest, maybe I can say the biggest Islamic organization in the world, because Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world. So NU scholar and NU or Nahdlatul Ulama, this Islamic, most of the Indonesian belong to NU. And the third one is MUI or Majlis Ulama Indonesia. It is the Indonesian Council of Ulama. They actually representative from a different of Islamic organization. So even in Indonesia itself, the ulama are still having, we can say, ikhtilaf or different of the opinions about what is riba is. Some of them say, like Muhammadiyah, they said riba or interest rate is prohibited. The reason behind that is that there is an existing of the exploitation. And Nahdlatul Ulama, they said that actually riba is prohibited. In somehow it can be also allowed in an emergency condition where the Islamic banking is not exist. And MOE strictly said, and it's followed the Majma'ul Fiqh al-Islami, and it says that any additional amount from the principal amount which is loan is actually riba or interest. So gharar is another actually form in which is not allowed in Islamic bank. It is a deception where sometimes the customer have no choice, take it or leave it. This is the contract. You want it, you take it or you leave it. So this is a gharar actually, where the customer actually have no other choice. And the maisir is the speculation or gambling, where the people actually earning money by way of speculation and the game of chance. There are so many people who are having the problem with the conventional insurance, where they pay the policy, they invest their money to pay the policy in the conventional insurance, but when they wanted to claim, they couldn't get what they want to claim. Actually, not all of the claim can be get. And another thing is that their money is not, they didn't get the dividends of the money which is invested in their conventional insurance. So at the Islamic banking system, they have the kaful system in which that they can get the dividends, like the money is invested and they can get a profit out of the investment that they have invested in the Islamic insurance. So another criticism about the Islamic finance instrument is that there is say Abdullah Said, he said that these interest-based transactions are just being renamed. So they said that Islamic products look very similar to conventional products. They are imitating the conventional. So these people are saying like that. Dusuki, Abu Zaid, Chaudhry, and Khan is also saying the same, that he said that Islamic finance have gone too far from the main purpose of the Sharia. So I would like to actually discuss more about this in the end, and I'm going to give opinion what is the true Islamic bank actually nowadays have done. So what is modern stratagem? The modern stratagem is a modern version of the Hila, they call it, in which it is bridging the gap between the classical and the contemporary financial practice. For example, that nowadays, most of the Islamic banking, they're using the interest rate as their benchmark in calculating the profit. For example, we want to buy a house and the price is like $100,000, and then the installment fee is like 1,200 per month, and they use the benchmark in which equal to the benchmark used in the conventional bank. In the end, that we have to pay total, then if 10 months, then it is 1,200, 10,200. Yeah. So another scholars found that there is a system of marrying two classical contract into one. They call it as al-uqud al-murakkabah. And some of them are saying they should use this al-uqud al-murakkabah in this modern banking system, because now, as you see that in Australia itself, they use like al-ijarah wal-iktina or al-ijarah al-muntahiyah bit-tamlik. It means that rent And then in the end, you will own the house. You are renting now, and then in the end, you will own the house. It is two contracts in one place, renting and also owning in the end. And so what is the skeptical view of customers in Indonesia about Islamic bank? Kasri and Kasim, he stated that the customers of Islamic banks are rational in Indonesia, depositors who are driven largely by the return that they get from saving. So even me, I myself, I have two accounts in Indonesia. I have Islamic bank accounts, I have the conventional bank accounts. And it is really hard for me actually not to use both of them. I have to use both of them. For example, I still accept my salary from my university from conventional banks. And then after that, I transfer all the money into the Islamic banks. And sometimes some other customers, even they look at the possibility of getting higher return in deposits. So once they deposit in conventional bank and then they also deposit in Islamic bank and they see the profit, if Islamic bank has higher profit, they will go to Islamic bank. If it is lesser, then they will go to the conventional bank. So that is why it is very hard actually for the Islamic bank in Indonesia how to maintain their reputation, because at the same time they say, wow, my money has been taken by the Islamic bank. They said like that, but actually at that time maybe the profit was not that much high as expected. And there is also critics about the late payments. For example, if somebody has late in paying the installment fee. So there is a critic which says that if someone pay late their Islamic their installment, they shouldn't be charged for the what we call like a fine. Some others said the bank can charge it as long as it is based on the condition in which that he do it by purpose. In my opinion, there's no one who want to do it by purpose actually, like you want to pay it late by purpose. So actually this is just the reason why actually the Islamic bank, the people, the scholars wanted to make sure that the people must actually ensure that they are able to pay the installment fee. If there is no fine, for example, there's a possibility that the customer will do it late all the time. There's no fine, no need to worry, we can pay it late, we can pay it later. So the ulama in Indonesia, the scholars from the Nahdlatul Ulama, from Indonesian Council of Ulama, and also from the Muhammadiyah, they have separated between ta'wid and gharama. For example, the ta'wid is like compensation, and the gharama is the penalty. The compensation here, the bank can take the fine and they can make it as their profit. But in gharama, the penalty, that they can give a penalty, but the money shouldn't go to the bank, it should go for the charity. So what is the controversy on rate of profit and returns? And as I have mentioned before, in deposit, sometime they didn't, in Islamic bank, the customer didn't get enough amount of money if they deposit in conventional bank. So the Islamic bank can use the profit equalization reserve, in which if the profit at that time was high, so they can save that profit for the future purpose. If the profit is lost, then they can add more from the profit which has been set before to give to the customer, so that the customer profit return will be equal as their competitors. So this is also based on the fatwa from the Indonesian Council of Ulama. And there is another critique about the profit and loss sharing. Actually, profit and loss sharing is the main, or like a crown of the Islamic bank. So there is a critique of, is the profit return in Islamic bank is nearly identical or closely aligned to the interest rate in the conventional banks. Siddiqui has comment here. He said that it appears that no matter how the transactions are structured by the Islamic banking and finance institution, as long as these are made into contract document, these are termed as Islamic. So according to them, that wherever it is, which is contract, which is available in Islamic bank, it is considered as Islamic. Yeah. The thing is, the different thing between the conventional interest rate and the profit return is that the Islamic bank use sometimes, if we look at the amount, it may be similar to the conventional bank, but actually they are different in some way in the way it is dealing with the customers. So that's why if we look at the amount, we couldn't really see from the amount of money. We should see from how it is operate, how it is the contract has been done between the customer and the bank. Mudarabah-based financing, as I said, is the jewel in the crown. It is actually the actual way of the Islamic banking operating actually. But unfortunately, at the moment, there are still critics about that, such as Azhar, who criticized that taking collateral will invalid the Mudarabah contract and will be the same as a pawnbroker. He said that actually what happened, the Sahibul Mal or the bank should give the
I am sorry, I think Romi has internet problem. His internet looks unstable. Let's wait for a few seconds, then I hope that he will come back. He will join back. Let's have a look. Yes, Romi, I think you have internet issue. But no.
Okay, you can hear the voice, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think you changed the room, huh?
Yeah.
All right, great.
Okay, up to here now. Okay, great. Now, there's a critic also about the Mudarabah product.
Romi, by the way, within 5 minutes, if you wrap up, summarize, then we will have a Q&A session. Yeah.
I'll take it 4 minutes.
Yes, all right.
Only questions left.
All right.
There's a contention where the customer have to pay back the profit return more than its own ratio. In Indonesia, actually, there are people who says that in the Mudarabah, they have to give the amount of money in which higher than what is expected in the contract, they say. So the MOE is also ensuring about this. They said that the profit sharing ratio should not be linked with the future prediction. There is no prediction. It should be based on the actual profit which is gained by the customer to pay the installment fee in Mudarabah. And then there is also criticism on the Murabah markup. So here, they said that Murabah is akin or equal, similar to the interest-based contract. Another saying that it is equal to the Bai' Ma'dum, in which that the people actually are, the bank is not own the bank, the good, and they just directly sell it to the customer. So the actual answer, based on my reading, says that Murabaha is a contemporary bank which is combined with the other contract. As I said, there is al-uqud al-murakkaba, which is hybrid contract in Murabaha. So this is also based on the Islamic jurisprudence, which says that al-aslu fil mu'amalah al-ibaha hatta yadullu dalil ala tahrimiha, in which that every contract actually is allowed as long as there is no prohibition on it. So that's why Murabaha using the contract of hybrid is allowed in Indonesia. So what about the using of the conventional interest rate as the benchmark? So in the classical finance, we don't find this, because in classical finance, there is no interest rate actually at that time. But in the modern Islamic banking finance, they can use the conventional interest rate as the benchmark. So how basically it's applied, because there is a markup cost in Murabaha. And second one is there is a commodities fluctuation. The price will not always be the same, especially the money. There is a fluctuation of money all the time. The money is like there's a, what do you call, like inflation in money. So bank is also prohibited from charging more to the client when the commodity prices fluctuate. In the Islamic bank, it is not allowed to charge more money after the contract has been done. So that is why the Islamic bank are allowed to use the conventional benchmark. And this is also a way of risk mitigation in Islamic banking. So almost 50% of Islamic bank profit is less competitive. Yeah. Why? Because they depend, mostly Islamic banks are still depending on the classical type of the profit and loss sharing, and they are less aware of the modern banking financial system, especially in Indonesia. Okay, in sum, I would like to say that there is still many significant problem and challenge remain in Indonesia, especially about the financial instruments, which is still subject to dispute, debate, and that is why there is a need of innovation in the Islamic banking or modernization. And there are still vast of skeptic perception among the Indonesian people about the Islamic bank. And there is a shift of religious preference of customers' commitment, such as which I said before, when the profit in the Islamic banking is lesser than the profit in the conventional bank, they will maybe move their money into the conventional bank because of this preference. And then tech exposure to improvement, as I said, there's the goals of future of Islamic bank is depend on the innovation of the regulation and supervision of Islamic bank, especially regarding of market demand, liquidity risks, and then interbank money market and all that. That's all. Thank you for your attention. And here are some of references. Thank you.
Romi, thank you so much. Thank you. I think very interesting and good points, and also a good summary of Islamic finance in Indonesia. It looks there are lots of discussions among Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyya movements and scholars. It looks the nature of Islamic banking, finance, riba, interest, prohibition of interest in Islam, in Islamic law, etc. There are discussions now. Do you have any questions to Romi? If you have any questions, please raise your hand, or maybe you can type on chat box, please, before Dr. Daud Batchelor's talk. If you have any questions, please, you can ask. Or any comments?
Can I make a comment? I'm sorry, I couldn't raise my hand. Sahib Hassan.
Please,
Yeah.
please, as an expert in this area.
I'm not an expert. There is no expert in this area because it's still developing.
Yeah.
Thanks for the presentation, Romi. It's quite enlightening, and you've touched on a number of things. I mean, there's a lot of questions, obviously, but I'm just going to ask one question. And it's relating to your last summary about innovation. Isn't the issue with current Islamic finance is the fact that there is too much innovation? That they have gone completely and adopted a Western, well-developed financial system and tried to fit it into a Sharia model, which hasn't really worked that well. All we've done is just changed some definitions, some words, added a few contracts, marketed something, and then here we go. We've got an Islamic finance industry. But the reality is we don't really have a Islamic finance industry. What we have is a conventional finance industry that has been dressed up to look a little bit Islamic. What do you think? What's your view on that?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ahmad. Yes.
I'm not a doctor, by the way.
Yes, I'm talking about the Indonesia as a case. Yeah, in Indonesia itself, there's only one Islamic bank which is purely from Islamic investors, which is built purely from the Islamic investors. The others Islamic bank in Indonesia, they are actually built from the conventional bank. So the conventional bank, they have they open their branch of Islamic bank, and then now they become independent of Islamic bank. So even the directors, the managers of that Islamic bank, they have a mindset of the conventional bank. So this Islamic bank also have there are so many contracts in which look like the conventional bank basically. But the only difference is that there is Maghrib, I call it Maghrib. Maghrib means Maisir. There is a prohibition of Maisir, and then there is a prohibition of Gharar, and there is a prohibition of Riba over there, and there is a Batil prohibition. That's why in Islamic bank, even though some people are still skeptical, they said it's just like a modification of the conventional bank. But for me, I still believe that this is still based on Islam. They do not sell the pork, they do not sell the alcohol, they do not invest on such things, and they also have a contract in which more clear than as compared to the conventional bank. In which they said that if you like it, you take it, otherwise go ahead. But in Islamic bank, when you come there, they will ask you if you agree with this, or if you're not agree with this, then there's like a bargaining. You may bargain. So there's a very clear contract in Islamic bank as compared to the conventional bank. So that's why I said, even though people say they look similar in terms of amount, if you borrow the money from Islamic bank and the conventional bank, sometimes the amount of money that you have to pay for the installment is even more expensive than that of conventional bank. But based on the contract, there is a clear contract right there, in which is compared to a conventional bank, you may have a fluctuation rate. Sometimes it is paying less, sometimes it can be paying more, even sometimes there's a hidden charge right there and you don't know. So there's a clarity of the contract over there, and they follow the Sunnah and they follow the Islamic rules. And they are also being supervised by the Islamic supervisors. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Fine.
Peter here. Can you hear me?
Yes, Peter, please.
Yes. Good afternoon, all, and great presentation. Look, I've got a more of a point to bring up in concern to the establishment and maintenance of Islamic banks in Indonesia. As you recall, at the turn of the century, there was a marked move by the bigger banks to literally rip apart any smaller banks throughout Indonesia. That was quite successful. So Mandiri, I could go through a gambit of them that did it. And they did it by offering credit by every other name bar credit. do you think that one of the greatest problems that we have in Indonesia, I live in Indonesia myself, is that when you have a look at these concepts, we still have to get around the issue of such large amounts of money being involved to be competitive. And again, I'll refer back to that time, but you also remember when OCBC came into Indonesia, the impact that huge amounts of money that became available to consumers had on all banks. I'm just, like I said, again, it's the number of customers that they can get that makes the difference. Do you think there's anything that will change to make that more competitive for Sharia compliant facilities? Thank you.
As I said before in my paper, the depositors, the customers, sometimes they are rational in Indonesia. They are more rational. They know if they get less amount of profit return when they invest in the Islamic bank, they may go to the conventional bank. That is why now the ulama, the scholars especially, they are thinking of how to not, let these customers go away from the Islamic bank, because there are so many people who has huge amount of money in Indonesia in which they think that Islamic bank is giving less profit return as compared if they are investing in the conventional bank. So in this way, there's innovation, they call it profit equalization reserve before, as I said, in which that if they get a lot of profit at that time, in the specific month, they will save some amount of money and then they can use it for the future purpose in the next month. And another thing, as I mentioned, in Islamic jurisprudence, in the fiqh muamalah, it says that al-aslu fil muamalah al-ibahah hatta yadullu dalil ala tahrimiha, in which that if this thing, such a profit equalization reserve, there is no prohibition of it in the Quran and Hadith, then the Islamic bank can use it. They can use these tools in order to grab more customers, especially who are having a huge amount of money, to come into the Islamic bank. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you, Romi. Thank you so much. I think it was a great presentation and also discussion time period. Thank you, Romi. I think we should finalize your session. If there are more comments or questions, I think you can continue through chat box. All right, you can respond. You can answer by chat box. Now, let's move on. Let's continue with the second presenter. Dr. Daud Batchelor is an adjunct fellow at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, Malaysia, where he did science, technology, environment, and ethics unit. He has a multidisciplinary background with a master's from the International Institute for Islamic Thought and Civilization, Kuala Lumpur, and Diploma of Islamic Studies from the International Islamic University of Malaysia. These institutions are very famous. And now, after a talk on Indonesia, now another great scholar and expert from Malaysia. It looks very good and interesting. For his PhD degree, Malaysia's leading university, University of Malaya, granted him its highest research award. He has a Master of Engineering Science from Griffith University. He was an assistant professor at Sultan Qaboos University, Oman, senior lecturer at the Science University of Malaysia, and including worked for MNC, including Exxon, Peabody and Energy, and Petronas Malaysia. Co-edited book Islamic Perspectives on Science and Technology, authored Muhammad, the Ultimate Leader, from Western Business Perspectives. He plays an active role in the Muslim community and co-founded the 1600-strong Islamic College of Brisbane. From Dr. Daud Batchelor is local as well, from Brisbane. Thanks for joining today. Looking forward to your talk. Your talk also looks very interesting. I have seen some references on social media. I think This your research looks very interesting. Yes, please.
Jazakallah. Respected academics, students, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum, and good afternoon. I'm speaking from sunny Queensland on the territory of the Jagera people, to whom I give my great respects. And I thank you, Dr. Hakan, and Professor Yusel for facilitating this talk today. I'd like to start with a brief personal anecdote. I embraced Islam almost 50 years ago in Indonesia, and almost immediately left with my wife for other countries. But I was always asking people, how are the Muslims in Indonesia and Islam under the Soeharto military rule? Not realizing that many years later, I would actually put together a well-being index that tries to objectively assess such well-being in Muslim-majority countries. I'm here today to update my index methodology, to pass this to you. From my original index was published in 2013, and I'm actually having more than 12,400 reads on the academic website ResearchGate, which is, alhamdulillah, quite a good following. So I intend to, I just probably reduce this. Focus on the Islamic well-being concepts related to Maqasid al-Sharia, and then look at the 2013 index, which was followed in 2015 by the deliberations of senior scholars who knew about my paper, and they're looking for a Sharia index. And then I'll look at the methodology for the upgraded 2021 Islamic Wellbeing Index, and then look at the country ranking results. So Allah Ta'ala indicates that belief and righteous acts leads to internal satisfaction, which I consider to be Islamic well-being. He says in translation in Surah Ar-Ra'd, without doubt, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find satisfaction. For those who believe and work, righteousness is every blessedness. And remember that word tuba, we'll come across that. And a beautiful place of final return. Serving God is humanity's ultimate function, the fulfillment of which constitutes well-being. And the correct condition is where the soul submits to its Lord in the mutmainah state, pleasing the Almighty. For the successful ones, Allah Ta'ala says in Surah Al-Fajr, Fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati. Enter you then among my devotees, enter you my heaven. Imam Abu Hamid Ghazali wrote that the objective of the Sharia is to produce the well-being of all mankind, which lies in safeguarding faith, iman, self, nafs, intellect, aql, posterity, nasl, and wealth, mal. Whatever safeguards these five serves the public interest, the maslaha, and is desirable, and whatever hurts them is against public interest. So these five are considered to be the necessities of a good life. 2013, this article, a new Islamic ranking index of well-being for Muslim countries. And there are two main fields from which parameters were selected. Fields of ibadah, acts of worship, and muamala, social transactions. And these were given equal weight. For muamala, the parameters chosen reflect adult literacy, status of women, care of children, income inequality, and corruption levels. And this was done for 27 Muslim majority countries for which we had full data. And this was the result, and Malaysia came first, Indonesia second, and surprisingly, Senegal came third. And so I made the comment that Islamic-minded tourists may wish to visit Senegal. And myself and my wife visited there in 2017, and we were enlightened by discovering the Muslims there displayed a high level of God consciousness. We found that they're blessed by the work of Sheikh Amadou Bamba, who died in 1927, who is the founder of the Mouridia Brotherhood. Traveling 2 hours east from Dhaka, the capital, into the Sahel on the southern margin of the Sahara Desert, we were amazed to see rising from the plain this beautiful mosque complex, which rivals the Prophet's Mosque in Medina to some extent. A beautiful mosque complex. And this was built by the Sheikh in a place he called Touba, named after a tree in paradise. And Touba City has become West Africa's #1 pilgrimage destination. So following in 2015, led by Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, deliberations were carried out to define, measure, and index Islamic contemporary statehood of Muslim states. Other scholars were Jassa Auda, Mohammed Hashim Kamali, Mohammed Larajani, and Recep Center. Abdul Rauf's methodology was developed more to evaluate Islamic governance, whereas we seek to measure the result of good governance, the result as reflected in spiritual and mental states of a country's Muslims. So the scholars contributed significantly to advance the robustness of the current Islamic Wellbeing Index approach, which reflects more heavily the Maqasid al-Sharia. So in 2021, we took the scholars' definition of the Sharia Maqasid objectives to identify proxy component parameters. For example, for nafs or life, we have 5 separate parameters to provide a composite value. We then conduct the data collection on component parameters, and I point out that virtually all of the data was pre-pandemic data, so this reflects in the index. Thirdly, we conducted statistical analysis of the component scores using a similar approach as the United Nations Human Development Index. And note that we gave the Dean value twice the weighting of any of the other 4 values of life, intellect, family, and wealth. And finally, so now we look at the individual maqsad or objectives. This is firstly protecting religion, which is the preservation and development of faith through spiritual enrichment, performing religious practices. For Deen, we only had data for 31 out of the 50 Muslim countries, and we didn't have data for all sheikdoms and certain African countries. And most of the data for Deen comes from the 2012 Muslims.
I think you
in terms of protecting this is utilizing and developing decisions. Abdul Rauf himself said that the Islamic State should provide. Sorry?
Yeah, that's okay. Yes, sometimes I think your internet is not stable. That's okay.
We're going all right. Okay. So Abdul Rauf said that an Islamic State should provide equal access to quality education for all men, women, and children. And the indicators were adult literacy rate, human capital index, female participation in secondary school, and press freedom index. Then we come to protection of nasal progeny or nasab lineage, which I enjoin under the family rubric. And here we're looking at protecting and promoting marriage and well-being of the family, considered in Islam to be the basic unit of society. And the primary goals here were procreation and safeguarding morality. The indicators, accrued marriage rate and accrued divorce over the accrued marriage rate and total fertility rate. Then we come to protecting wealth, which is the protection of ownership and property from damage, harm, theft, or injustice. It's also the development of wealth by making it available through circulation and equitable distribution. Omar Chapra stated that wealth is a trust from God, fulfilling the needs of all, making life as comfortable as possible, and promoting the equitable distribution of income and wealth. The indicators here selected are the Gini coefficient of inequality or equality, unemployment, corruption, perception index, ecological footprint, and Islamic finance development index. 1.7 times faster than ecological footprint are assessed more positively. So, so then we come to the actual results. And firstly, for the Dean objective, and Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, Chad, all West African countries at the top. And we find that last in this field are the former communist bloc countries. Then we come to life, and notice the 5 parameters I've chosen here: peace index, poverty index, homicides, life expectancy, and the environmental protection index. And the best performers are the Arabian Gulf countries and Southeast Asia, with UAE, Brunei, and Kuwait leading. Then we have the results for AQL, and the best performers are the former communist countries, Maldives and Malaysia. Those that do worst are African and war-torn countries. For female participation in secondary school, the Gulf Arab and former communist countries do best. For the family, the countries that score well are non-Gulf Arab countries and Senegal. So most of the leading countries here follow the Maliki madhab, where the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's teachings on treating women well are more faithfully practiced in family life. Countries that score best for male are Malaysia, UAE, and Burkina Faso. Countries that do worst are war-torn countries and those recently in conflict. Income equality is best in former communist countries and Algeria. So bringing the 4 non-religion results together for life, mind, family, and wealth, and crunching the numbers, Tunisia came first, UAE second, and Kyrgyzstan third. The war-torn countries and African countries were the worst, with Nigeria last. And this brings for discussion an intriguing finding. In 2013, our Islamic Wellbeing Index found that West African countries that display the Ummah's highest levels of personal religiosity also demonstrate the lowest levels of social interactions. This is confirmed, this pattern is confirmed by my 2021 index, with Nigeria appearing last in the non-Deen Maqasid table. So my hypothesis on why the West African countries are leading in Deen, in Ibadah, but performing worst in all the other elements. I believe that quite a number of Muslim leaders in these countries have an incorrect view that Islam comprises only individual ritual worship, rather than that worship is comprehensive, covering everything a person says or does, seeking Allah's pleasure. Islam includes a person's relationship with their spouse, children, relatives, and business relations. I believe that Islam's role in West Africa narrowed to core practices as a survival response to the severe depredations from the European slave trade and colonialism, whose impacts are affecting West Africa until today. So then we come to, the actual rankings for the Islamic Wellbeing Index for 2021. And these are rankings for 31 countries for which we have full data. Indonesia is first, Tunisia second, Malaysia third, Jordan fourth, and Morocco fifth. And the next table just follows suit in sequence. And I point out that although the 2013 indices were not recalculated, it is clear that significant changes in some countries' standings occurred in the interim 8 years. The most improved countries compared to 2013 were Lebanon, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Egypt. Obviously, Lebanon has dropped in the last 18 months or 2 years. Following on, those who are ranked lower down in the table are here. So that the countries that scored well in the non-Deen Maqasid objectives, they ended with the lowest rankings overall because of low levels of religiosity, as shown here. So these are former communist countries: Kosovo, Albania, and Uzbekistan. So the overall results, we find that Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country and successful democracy, performed best. Since the 2004 tsunami, Indonesia exhibited growing moderate Islamic resurgence, reflected in greater Muslim political participation and the dissemination and practice of Islamic teachings. We saw improvements for Tunisia, Jordan, and Morocco, which reflect, I believe, a trend for Middle Eastern Muslims, especially youth, away from secular Arab nationalism. And countries whose Islamic index fell the most since 2013 were Afghanistan and Nigeria. Afghanistan showed the greatest Islamic Wellbeing Index decline of any country over 8 years. This finding is confirmed by the 2018 Gallup poll, finding that Afghans' ratings of their own lives now, as well as predicted in 5 years' time, fell below record lows ever recorded by any country surveys conducted by Gallup poll. This is obviously related to the climate of fear from 40 years of continuous conflict. And we only hope under the Taliban rule that Islamic well-being will rise. Nigeria has been affected by deteriorating security related to the rise of Boko Haram and other militant groups in northern Nigeria. Overall, there's a grouping of countries into regions, best to worst, with Southeast Asian countries performing best, followed by non-Gulf Arab countries, and Burkina Faso and Senegal, Bangladesh, Turkey, Pakistan, with former communist bloc, other African and war-torn countries coming down below. So to compare how Muslim majority countries were really performing in the world, I compared the indicator averages with world averages. And obviously, Muslim countries are performing better than the world averages in their significantly higher levels of religiosity, homicide rate more equal and impact. However, sadly, some of the parameters used in calculating the Wellbeing Index perform worse than the world average, such as Peace Index, female participation in secondary schools, press freedoms, maternal mortality, unemployment. So this result challenges Muslim majority countries that they improve in these fields, which are essential for Islamic well-being. Now, the benefits of the Islamic Wellbeing Index is that it provides practical insights for countries that aspire to move to a higher state. And leading countries in the separate Maqasid fields could represent role models for lagging countries. And the Islamic Wellbeing Index indicators provide a way to spot problems, set targets, track trends, and identify best practice policies. So in conclusion, I note that the significant rise in Islamic Wellbeing Index 2021 of Tunisia to attain second place is a striking endorsement of the success of Tunisia's Arab Spring, led by Rachid Ghannouchi's party Ennahda, and its soft approach in promoting an Islamic civil society. And further, Shadi Hamid, in his 2016 book, Islamic Exceptionalism, indirectly validates our Islamic well-being approach in endorsing the otherwise surprising finding that Indonesia and Malaysia have topped within the first three rankings in 2013 and 2021. He wrote that Indonesia and Malaysia feature significantly more Sharia ordinances than Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, or Lebanon. And that while Indonesia and Malaysia are led by secular-based parties, these parties had to enact Sharia legislation to satisfy popular demands of citizens for Islam to play a central role in law and governance. And finally, I recommend that a Muslim organization needs to be funded to conduct periodic surveys of all 50 Muslim majority countries to fill data gaps, especially in religiosity and marriage divorce rates. And that respected Muslim professionals are needed who can promote and advise on Islamic values in the Maqasid fields as seen in leading countries to help uplift the state of citizens in laggard countries. And that special attention is warranted to identify the best approach towards enhancing Islamicity in the former communist bloc and for helping African countries that lag in the non-Din Maqasid fields. And finally, the Islamic Wellbeing Index should be prepared and published annually. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Thank you so much, Ustaz, Dr. Daud Batchelor. I think it looks very interesting. Findings and statistics. Thank you so much. I think it looks great. All right, let's look at the audience. Do you have any questions to Dr. Batchelor? Any questions? Yes, David?
Yeah, hi there. I was just wondering if you could explain to me why in the index you put the Deen component of the Maqasid as worth twice the value of all the other ones, because it was unclear. Thank you.
Yes, well, in my 2013, I divided like basically Islamic law into ibadah and muamala and given them equal weighting. So
okay.
I have actually reduced the weighting for Deen, if you like, from 50% to 33% of the total. It's actually based on the deliberations of the Islamic scholars in 2015, particularly Yasser Oda, who basically suggested that sort of weighting.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that's fine. It just didn't make sense when you first mentioned it, why that would be double the rest. So that's fine. Thank you so much for that.
All right. Thank you. Before Halim, thanks joining for Dr. Halim Rain, by the way. But before you just, Father Francis, your question, then after that, Dr. Halim. Yes, Father Francis.
I don't have a question. I was just clapping.
All right.
I don't have a question. Yeah.
All right, that's
Yeah,
okay. Please, Professor Halim Rain, any questions or comments?
Thank you. Salam alaikum, Dr. Batchelor. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, Prof. Halim.
Good to see you. Are you in Brisbane or are you down in Sydney?
Yeah, I'm in Brisbane.
Okay.
How about yourself?
I'm in Brisbane too. It's a subtle point, but potentially a significant one. Does your index give any consideration to the difference between Islam in its original message, according to the Quran and the Prophet, that we may not know 100% completely, and the religion that we call Islam that came to develop in the centuries after the death of the Prophet? And for example, if we look at what's in Islamic jurisprudence and books of Sharia and so on, we find a significant amount of diversity across time and across place. And I'm not suggesting that there is a huge difference between the original message of Islam and what has come to be understood as Islam, but I'm also not saying we should just assume that they are verbatim identical. For example, people like Professor Muhammad Hashim Kamali and many others have pointed out, even conceptually, there are concepts that are very integral to the Islam of the later centuries, so like the concept of Sharia and fiqh, for example, that are not part of the lexicon and the discourse of the Prophet in the same sense. The concept of a khalifa is a different concept from what a khalif is different in the Quran from the way you see this term being used in later centuries. What I'm trying to say is that there's a subtle difference, and when we start to talk about religion and religiosity, I think it's important to tease out what the differences might be between the original message and what has come to be formulated in the centuries later that we call now the religion of Islam, because it does include elements that are the product of a later time, place, and circumstances. That's all.
Yeah, thank you for that insightful question, Brother Halim. Yes, we take those comments on board, and I guess we're putting emphasis, and also the scholars that I mentioned who deliberated and published in 2015, that it appears that there seems to be a lot of consensus for adopting Maqasid al-Sharia as a sort of a standard reference in determining this sort of Islamic Wellbeing Index, which was, elaborated upon by Abu Hamid Ghazali and Al-Shatibi and others, who's Hujjat al-Islam, who's got a high respect in the Muslim world. And it's also an approach emphasized by my own CEO, Mohammed Hashim Kamali, to test, rulings according to Sharia, whether they're actually achieving the objective that they're intending. So I feel pretty confident, and most of the other, because there are other workers who have worked in this field generally in developing indexes in the field of economics and governance, that they also refer to Maqasid al-Sharia. But I take on board the concern of achieving consonance with the Quranic and Sunnatic prophetic teachings, the truth of them. And I have done my own research in terms of women's fiqh, and I found that even in our classical tafsir, Ibn Kathir, and even in the fiqh madhab of a number of the madhabs, that there has crept in an un-Islamic patriarchal bias. And from 2013, I actually chose certain parameters which tend to overcome that particular bias, and carried on with that in the 2021 updated methodology. So yeah, I think we've got to sort of keep these things in mind, that we're trying to achieve consonance with the actual pristine teachings with our index. May Allah help us in that respect.
Thank you, Professor Halim, and thank you also, Dr. Daud, for your response. Any other questions or comments?
Dr. Hakan, I have just
yes,
a quick
please.
question.
Yes, please.
Thank you for this very brilliant presentation on the index. I wanted to know to what extent the ideas of Dr. Jasir Auda, the latest one on Maqasid, has contributed into this, or what aspect of his ideas on Maqasid, especially the contemporary Maqasid theory of Jasir Auda, with his latest book, Re-Envisioning Islamic Scholarship. Have you benefited from this work? Thank you.
Yes, I have attended talks by Jasir Auda at the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies in Kuala Lumpur, and listened to him, and also like his views, which are recorded in the published book in 2015. So I found his views, very valuable and very learned, and so put with, I mean, we can accept because of his massive scholarship in this particular field. But I haven't sort of gone into special study of his subsequent works, I must admit. But I do have a couple of his books, and I do hold him in the highest regard. And perhaps I should read his latest book to update myself on his current position on matters relevant to this index, inshallah.
Thank you.
All right, Brother Hafiz, thanks for your question. Thank you, Dr. Batchelor. I wish we could have more time to discuss, but because we have a limited time now, David will continue with his presentation. Thank you so much. But it is very interesting findings and statistics across Muslim states, Muslim countries. Thank you. While you focused on, you discussed a little bit based on Maqasid Sharia. Now, David will be focusing on this concept, but from Maliki fiqh perspective. In the West, we don't have much experts on Maliki fiqh. It is good that David is focusing on this area and really working very hard on Maliki usul al-fiqh and Islamic law, Islamic jurisprudence. Yes, please.
Thank you. So I just shared my screen. I hope everyone can see it.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you once again, first of all, for the opportunity to present my ongoing PhD research. So I'm going to apologize in advance because my topic's a bit different from the previous two presentations. I'm also Scottish, so we speak fast by default, and I also speak quickly when I'm nervous. I've lost the accent, so you can probably understand me better, though. Okay, so as you can see, the title of my PhD is it's quite a mouthful, but hopefully it'll become apparent through the rest of this presentation. So the first thing I'm going to do is give a brief outline to the presentation before we kind of dive right into it. So first thing I'll do, obviously, is give an overview of my research topic and highlight its relevance before going on to briefly discuss the three main subsections of my literature that my PhD research builds on. I then clarify the theoretical framework I'm using for my research before identifying the gap and outlining my research methodology, and then giving a very brief outline of the remaining PhD thesis chapters. So trying to do a whole PhD presentation in 20 minutes, it's a challenge. Okay, so my research focuses on two Mauritanian jurists, religious scholars who lived at the turn of the 20th century. So Ma'al-Aynayn al-Khalqami, who died in 1910, and Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, who died in 1912. So they were contemporaries, although Ma'al-Aynayn was slightly senior. They were both born, raised, and received their Islamic education in the town of Walata, which at that time was an important trading hub in the southeast of what is now Mauritania. And I have a map a bit later on, which will kind of help you locate this place. So my research does this in order to understand their connection to and the engagement with Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi, who died 1388, and his work on Maqasid and Islamic legal theory, or usul al-fiqh more generally. So they were both highly respected Maliki scholars that were known throughout the region, and indeed they both went on pilgrimages to Mecca, and they were, warmly received by scholars throughout every step of their journey. So, in this sense, my thesis is titled "Beyond Flexibility in Fatwas," because I'm not focusing on using Maqasid to derive new rulings for contemporary issues, as so many researchers and scholars have done before, but instead I'm focusing on the reception of Shatibi's works and concepts by these two particular jurists, who again are within the Maliki legal school, the same legal school that Shatibi belonged to. So my aim and the relevance of the research is to provide another perspective on the historical transmission, the engagement with and reception of Shatibi's work that's largely been ignored to the present day. And my research builds upon three interrelated areas of literature and three overlapping theoretical concepts. So we'll go into those. The first one I call Islamic law and the problem of legal change, which has drawn the attention of researchers since the colonial period. So Strawson's quote at the top is referring to the colonial context, so we could probably add French to that as well, for example, but it also has wider relevance for the present in that there's often a disconnect with what appears in English and what's written in Arabic or other so-called historic Muslim languages. So it's worth just bearing that in mind. A narrative of sorts developed in Western academia through the relationship between Western academics, so-called Orientalists, and Muslim reformists, that Islamic law, as currently understood, is or was disconnected from the lived reality of Muslims due to it being a divine law simply understood and followed via emulation or taqlid. So according to this narrative, it required a creative process or ijtihad by Muslim scholars to derive new rulings suitable for the modern and indeed our own contemporary contexts. So this led, for example, to academics stating, even 30 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, that you could look at any legal text from, say, between 1800 and 18,000, and this was representative of Islamic law or equally as authoritative, which sounds incredible when you actually think about it, because it's an entire millennium of intellectual output and written works that's being talked about and thrown away in that sentence there. So in the last 30 or so years, research has shown that pre-modern muftis, the fatwas they produce, and the textual output of what Wal Halak calls author jurists were instrumental in extending the law to new cases, which then became subsumed in the textual corpus of the various legal schools or madhabs. However, this research approach shifted when dealing with more recent history, so from around 1850 onwards. The focus then became overwhelmingly that of so-called reformist scholars and intellectuals rather than the so-called traditional scholars and their texts and fatwas. So contemporaries of reformist scholars have been almost entirely ignored or neglected. So for example, everyone here has read about anything to do with Islamic thought in the modern period, you probably know who Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abdu are, but they've probably never heard of the likes of Abdurrahman Urlaysh, who died in 1921, or Yusuf ad-Dijawi, who died in 1946, who were their contemporaries. Both of them in Al-Azhar and senior scholars there produced multiple texts across numerous traditional genres of Islamic law and religious thought, but they were critical of this reformist approach. So I mentioned those two in particular because of their important connection to the Maliki school, because they were representatives of the Malikis in Azhar. And it's the notion of the Maliki school itself that I turn to next. So the Maliki madhab has generally been kind of neglected as a subject of detailed study in academia outside of the formative period and the kind of singular talented individual jurists from the medieval period. So more focus has generally been found, for example, on the Ottoman Empire and the Hanafi madhab there, especially after the time of Abu Sa'ud Effendi, who was one of the most important Shaykh al-Islams in the Ottoman Empire. So from around 1500 onwards, there's been a lot more research. The works of Yassin Dutton and Omar Farooq Abdullah, for example, are incredibly important for understanding the terminologies of the Maliki school, but they focus almost exclusively on Imam Malik himself and the Muwatta and other early texts. Likewise, academic researchers such as Halak and David Powers focused on fatwas by Ibn Rushd al-Jad, who died in 1126 and was the grandfather of Averroes. Sherman Jackson and Muhammad Fadil have focused on Shihab ad-Din al-Qarafi, who died in 1285, who was the head of Malikis in Egypt in his time. David Powers focused on the important fatwa collection of Wanshirisi. It's like a 12-volume fatwa collection, around 6,000 different fatwas in it, which collected together around 500 years of fatwas from all across North Africa and Muslim Spain up until around 1500. It's a mammoth project. So the reason I keep mentioning the dates of death should become clearer as my presentation continues. So there's not really been anything analyzing the latter day scholarship of the Maliki school, by which I mean from around 1500 onwards, until recently. And that's the work of Eti Terim on the 12-volume fatwa collection of Al-Mahdi al-Wazani, who died in 1923 and was based in Fez in Morocco. Her theoretical approach and framework is important for my own research, especially her insightful comments regarding the false dichotomy between tradition and reform. However, in that particular book and her wider articles, her study focuses only on about 9 fatwas out of over 5,000. So it's not really representative of the entire corpus of the Maliki school or even the fatwa collection itself due to its small sample size. However, it does provide a lot of grounding for further research to be done. So jumping from Morocco and a little bit further south, you can see on the map, we end up in the Sahara region, which primarily includes Mauritania, but also parts of Mali, southern Algeria, and further afield. The academic focus on this region has largely been constrained by colonial interests until recently, and it's focused generally on 2 things. First is Sufism, or what they call in academia neo-Sufism, due to it being a type of revivalist Sufism as they've characterized it there, and also the so-called jihads against both the colonial powers, in this case is overwhelmingly the French, but also the British in northern Nigeria, but also more recently due to this security studies focus on the region and the focus on transnational extremist movements that work within that kind of porous desert environment. The lines literally drawn on the map don't adequately demarcate boundaries at all because it's a desert. And such groups, as well as tribal, cultural, and social networks, have existed throughout and across these artificial boundaries since before they were drawn. So just for a sense of scale, you can see on the map there, I've mentioned we've mentioned Walata and Timbuktu. So just for a sense of scale for those of us in Australia, Walata and Timbuktu are about as far apart as Sydney is from Wagga, or between Sydney and most of the way to Port Macquarie if we're going up the coast, for example. So it's not an insurmountable distance, and that general region shared a kind of cultural, cultural and learning framework that was common throughout that area, all the way through to Senegal. So we have researchers such as Leiden, who focused on the trade networks across the northwestern Sahara region, primarily between the south of Mauritania, parts of Mali, and southern Morocco, which is slightly below and left of my other point there of Tamalgrut in southern Morocco there. So Islamic law is obviously connected to this, given its focus on business and trade. I mean, the previous presentations mentioned some aspects of that. And Leiden mentioned a number of scholars and authorities, even looking at a few specific fatwas issued by 19th century Mauritanian scholars, but she didn't study the Islamic legal tradition of Mauritania in any systematic way or in detail. One of the most interesting things she did bring to light, however, was how religious scholars and jurists played a type of mediation role, because in that particular region, there was no centralized authority structure. There was no sultan, for example, or any type of government structure like that. So you had competing kind of local leaders and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of fighting happening at that time. And religious scholars and jurists played a type of mediation role there. There's also been a lot of recent manuscript research discussing a so-called core curriculum of texts that are used throughout the Western Sahara and Sahel region. So basically from Senegal all the way through to Nigeria, of course, including Mauritania and Mali and so forth as well. But most of this has been focused on cataloging the works. There's been little engagement with the Islamic intellectual kind of tradition from this peripheral region compared to the more core regions of the Ottoman Empire and the Hijaz. So the Western Sahara is still somewhat considered mysterious and alien. In some aspects, it's considered the remnants of a traditional way of life or learning that no longer exists. And there is this, what you might call a type of Orientalist imagination at play regarding this. And just to give a few examples briefly, this first image is from 1887, and it's drawn by a French explorer who was shipwrecked off the coast of what's now Mauritania and captured by some nomads. He was imprisoned, and then Ma al-Ainain set him free due to his authority and prestige. You know, he's a big scholar in the region. And then on his return, the captured prisoner made this drawing. So you can see Ma al-Ainain there with a follower reading a text, and all of his other students or followers making supplication around the tent. I'm not quite sure what the person on the ground is doing. There's no description given with it, but it looks like begging or something perhaps, but it very much captures that kind of Oriental kind of desert mystique. You know, you can see the tent, you can see the sand, the men covering their faces and so forth. And this kind of feeling has kind of continued until the present. So you can see these pictures. So the first one focuses on the so-called badass librarians of Timbuktu, who many of you may know because they were rescuing the manuscript heritage of Timbuktu and the wider region from destruction by the extremists there who wanted to basically destroy everything. And then on the right, you see the architectural history of Walata itself, which is a World Heritage Town, but because of desertification and climate change, the sand's literally engulfing it. So you can see both of these attitudes focus more on the physical objects and than the actual text themselves and the knowledge from both the manuscripts and the place, because the learning happens in a location, doesn't it? So a major output of the region was in Islamic legal theory, or usul al-fiqh, and that's the third aspect of my literature that I turn to next. So research on Maqasid or the objectives of the law have focused on the development of this concept from its origins until Shatibi. So it highlights the contributions of giants in the field. Daud previously mentioned the likes of Al-Ghazali and so forth, so all the way from Imam Juwayni to Ghazali to Fakhruddin Razi, Al-Qarafi for the Maliki side, and culminating with Shatibi. So after that, everything pretty much stops and then focuses on modern contemporary outputs. And largely, these outputs are confined into kind of three distinct groups. So you have the so-called modernist or utilitarian approach, and it's best exemplified by the likes of Yusuf al-Qaradawi today and Ahmed al-Risuni, who, although Moroccan, he's more closely associated with Qaradawi's approach rather than the Maliki school itself. There's the progressive approach, best exemplified by the works of Muhammad Hashim Kamani over the last 30 years or so, and others who built upon his framework today. I mean, the previous presentation basically did that, so this is wonderful. And then we have the so-called Maqasid critical approach, which is exemplified by the late Said Ramadan al-Buti's work on Maqasid and Maslaha, but also others such as Imam and Ahmed, who argue that this approach has limited actual value in allowing Islamic law to deal with contemporary issues. And the explosion of text over the last 50 years in particular has taken the Maqasid theory, which was originally, it was a subsidiary legal interpretive tool as part of the wider subject of Islamic legal theory. They've expanded it to include things like Maqasid approaches to Quranic exegesis or tafsir, Maqasid approaches to politics and international relations, Maqasid approaches to environmentalism, and even a Maqasid connected framework for Islamic well-being, which we just had a presentation on. So that's a perfect example. So Shatibi's work and that of Ibn Ashur, who wrote his own Maqasid work in the 1940s, have been taken as springboards to a much more ambitious intellectual projects aimed at reconciling Islamic beliefs and practices with modern ethical, political, and cultural concerns. However, my own research is not as concerned with this particular turn as with the reception of Shatibi's thought before the mid-20th century. So it's built on three theoretical concerns, which I turn to next. So I've put some selected quotes on this slide and the next one to allow you to understand how these all interact as a basis for my research. So just bear that in mind. So work on the concept of tradition by the likes of Talal Asad and his famous notion of discursive tradition is well known. Also the likes of Graham and his notion of connectedness, what he calls itisaliya in Arabic, are major sources for my own conception of tradition. Likewise, it's the work of the late Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gyeke, who shows this process is actually a process of active engagement and not merely passive and uncritical conservation. So this correlates nicely with the concept of reception theory or reception history, which developed out of the hermeneutic works of Heidegger and Gadamer and has become especially prominent in biblical studies. So reception history focuses not only on the actual meanings of the text itself, but on its contexts over time. So it's social and intellectual history that led to its development, as well as its place in the lives of those who came after it. It's social, cultural, and intellectual transmission in the works of those who came after it, as a means of not only understanding the text itself, but of how the text was valued and used by societies that came after it. So this ties in squarely with the way Islamic texts were actually taught and used throughout history until the present. So there was a base text called a matin in Arabic that was commented upon, called a sharh, and that was further given a further commentary or gloss known as a hashia. And at some point, because of the length of some of these, they were probably abridged, which is a type of text called mukhtasar, and then that was likely commented upon as well. And so the cycle kind of continued over time. So the magic, as it were, happened in the details contained within these layers of texts, as well as their wider context throughout that time. And analyzing it is through understanding that legal texts can be considered a genre or multiple subgenres of literature. So each type of text has its own formal structure and constraints, its technical terminology and modes of expression. They can be analyzed using techniques from literary criticism and discourse analysis, which is how I'll be engaging the source text throughout my PhD. The quotes on the slide show how this has been approached in regards to the common law tradition in the West, but emphasizes that the jurist also has to know how a text has been received and its historical usage in order to create a new ruling and thereby extend its relevance. And in fact, in almost any kind of legal system, authority is invested in precedent and new rulings are built upon the old to show continuity, even if change exists within that. So the Islamic legal tradition and legal schools, it was and is the same in that regard. So there's not really any difference there. Legal systems are legal systems. So we've now come to the gap part and how I propose to fill it with my research. So the standard narrative is of decline and then reform in Islamic legal thought. Muhammad Abdu is considered a central figure within this, and his general approach to Maslaha and Maqasid were the impetus for his students, especially the likes of Rashid Rida and others, to popularize this approach from the 1920s onwards. And then after that, there's kind of explosion of Maqasid-themed texts. So most works on Islamic legal thought that mention Maqasid jump between Shatibi to either Muhammad Abdu, who died in 1905, or in fact to Ibn Ashur, who died in 1973, when they're highlighting independent works on Maqasid. So I've mentioned the dates of death throughout this in order to highlight the actual historic gap. So in this case, Shatibi died in 1388, and his text was printed for the first time in 1884. So it's an almost 500-year gap. So significant works on Maqasid happened from around the mid-20th century onwards. So it's almost a further century later after that. So my research is literally focusing on that gap. So what happened between those dates? How was Shatibi's work transmitted and engaged? And also, was there engagement with Shatibi parallel to Abdu's revival project that we're unaware of? Or, like basically what's happening in that space? So my research focuses on filling both the literal time gap and the intellectual gap as much as possible through the lens of focusing both on Ma'alainain and Muhammad Yahya al-Walati, who were active throughout the late 1800s into the early 20th century. And this is best seen visually, I think. It makes my project clear. So this is a kind of standard narrative, if you like, of Shatibi's Muwafaqat and the subsequent works that came out on Maqasid. So the dashed line represents an unclear transmission. So we know Shatibi wrote his text and somehow it was printed almost 500 years later. So my research attempts to fill in the missing gaps as much as possible, as well as look at parallels. So the result is actually a lot more complex than previously thought. This is a bit more like this. So through focusing on Walati and Ma'alainain, I traced their parallel engagement with Shatibi's work. So the work of Walati in particular, and that of the Mauritanian scholars a few generations before him, preserve engagement with Shatibi's work that's not reliant on the printed edition from Tunis, and indeed show that Muwafaqat was known in the region and quoted directly. So both Walati and Mar al-Ainain received early copies of the Tunis printed edition of Shatibi's Muwafaqat, and they produced their own abridgments and commentaries on it as well. So you can see it on the timeline that this is actually before the kind of modern printed edition in Egypt from the 1920s that was by Abdu's students. So this was all happening parallel to that and disconnected from that. So I included here some manuscript images of both Muwafaqat and the Usul al-Fiqh work of Ibn Asim, who was Shatibi's main student, dating from around the 1600s in the kind of Northwest Africa region, to highlight that there's actual textual evidence and actual textual engagement with both of these works that remain understudied. And this helps to fill the time gap as well as the intellectual gap. So my research methodology is primarily text-based, focusing mostly on the written works of Walati and Mar al-Ainain, and in the interrelated realms of usul al-fiqh or legal theory and qawaid fiqhiyya or legal maxims. It aims to not only analyze their textual output, but provide the context on their engagement with Shatibi historically, socially, culturally, and intellectually. So secondary sources, which are mostly in Arabic, with also some French and German thrown in where necessary, will be used to provide further context as to their lives and works. So the overall focus is on the intellectual output and conceptualization of Islamic law in their immediately colonial context, but more specifically their relationship to Shatibi and his ideas. So what they took from his works, if they agreed with him or disagreed, and how they placed his work in discourse. Excuse me. In discourse with other Maliki scholars. Apologies, I'm feeling a little bit unwell.
No problem, David.
So this is best achieved by breaking it down into a number of further chapters and sections, loosely as follows. So first, I discuss and ground the research in the detailed understanding of the Mauritanian Islamic learning system called the Mahadir system. Its main text and the scholars used to train generations of jurists in learning the Maliki school, and also the place of Walata within that as an institution and the school system. After that, I then focused in detail on the transmission and reception and engagement with Shatibi's Muwafaqat, the theories of Maqasid within it in the Mauritanian intellectual world. So I traced the transmission directly as well as indirectly by Shatibi's main students' work and the commentary works that on his and Shatibi's text as shown in the previous diagram. I then study how this notion of Maslaha and Maqasid is used by Mauritanian Maliki scholars in crafting fatwas via focusing on an important text that outlines the sources of the Maliki method and the process of consulting them to basically find the position of the school on a legal matter and then craft a fatwa from it. So I couple this with some case studies of specific fatwas from the region that highlight this process at work. And finally, I revisit the previously mentioned framework of approaches to Maqasid and argue for a fourth to be included, which is the mainstream Maliki engagement with Shatibi until today. So I did produce a nice Gantt chart, as all PhD students are meant to do for their thesis. The COVID lockdown and things has somewhat modified it, but my writing is still on track with adjustments made. So I've managed to present at a number of conferences and submitted one journal article at present over this last year. And so I'm basically at the end now. So I welcome any questions, comments, or feedback on that. And thank you so much for listening.
All right, David, thank you so much. I think you covered very well your research project. Thank you. I think directly, I think we should give some time to your reviewers. And first, thank you so much. First, Professor Halim Rein and Dr. Aydoğan Kars for joining today. To this confirmation seminar for David Drennan's PhD research project. Thank you so much. I think we will have a short private panel after the colloquium. For this, just if you can provide some general feedback, then after that you can, in our private panel, you can give more detailed feedback. Of course, you have written report as well. I think if you don't mind, Halim, we should start with Halim. Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Halim, please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, David. Excellent presentation, and I've read your paper as well. I thoroughly enjoyed reading that. Great to see such research being done, such an important topic, original work as well. I suppose the only question, and your presentation helped me understand this a better, especially the chart that you provided. Sure. But I'm just wondering whether or not your research needs to take on this ambitious challenge of filling a 500-year gap.
Yeah,
I think I'm just looking at the research questions that you've got.
Yeah,
they don't actually align with that so clearly. Right. And I'm just wondering if you need to. I mean, it could be stated as a side of the research, but I don't know if you need to claim that this is one of the.
It doesn't fill all of that gap. I don't think we can fill all of that gap. It definitely provides a bit more space regarding the transmission after Shatibi's death via his student and that immediate generation. I can also, based on my research thus far, push back reception of Shatibi to around the mid 1700s, if not before that, maybe around the 1700 mark. So, but there's still a gap.
Yes. So just to be clear in my mind, what you're proposing to do is looking at the work of Al-Kalamani and Al-Walati.
Yes.
Looking at who they're quoting from.
So partly,
demonstrate more or less a continuous chain of quoting from Shatibi.
It's basically transmission. It doesn't go all the way back directly to Shatibi, but it definitely shows, at least from the 1700s, for example, which is about 200 years, 150 to 200 years before the printed edition, that they knew Shatibi's works, they were engaging it. There's direct quotation that matches up exactly with the sentences and paragraphs from Muwafaqat and so on. So it shows that the text was known. And there is a provenance for that. Okay. So I'm looking at how they, as within their school framework, the Maliki school framework, are engaging him through that process. Yeah.
So look, I don't really have no criticisms at all, but my only suggestion, just to make life easier for you when an examiner looks at this, is to maybe just scale back a little bit what you're going to deliver. And maybe say what can be learned from looking at the work of two early, 20th century scholars, all passed away in the early 20th century. What can we learn from that about the continuity of reference to Shatibi's Muwafaqat?
So frame it better. No problem.
Just the rewording of that. That'd be my only.
No problem. Thank you for that. That's great. Thank you. It's definitely something that needs to be tightened up. So that's perfect. Thank you.
Halim, thank you so much, Dr. Han. We will continue with detail after the colloquium. Yes, Dr. Aydoğan Kars, please.
Of course. Thank you for the invitation. First of all,
thank you so much.
Thank you, David. I think this is the most well-developed proposal I have ever read. It is wonderful. It is very much detailed, so it's excellent. So I see the progress is very good, and I'm really kind of excited about this project.
Thank you so much.
So I think we will provide detailed feedback, after the colloquium.
I appreciate it.
But just maybe ask you, like Halim, I might ask a broad question about the way in which you will trace the heritage of Al-Shatibi. You mentioned ijazas, you mentioned how there were kind of, sama sessions where some master recites the text to disciples, then they transmitted so on and so forth. Is it relying on the study of manuscripts, for example, and is it a particular text where you are able to see, this guy transmitted to that guy, and that guy to that guy, so on and so forth?
In some sense. So, for example, the way I stumbled across this particular topic was I was studying one of the texts of Al-Walati in Usul Fiqh, which is actually a commentary on Ibn Asim, so Shatibi's student's text on Usul. And he mentions in it that I'm using as a source the Qawaid of Ash-Shatibi. And I said, there's no text by Shatibi that we know of called Qawaid. But then when I started looking at it, he's quoting a previous Mauritanian authority who quoted Shatibi. So this authority died in the 1790s, but almost verbatim segments of it are taken from the Muwafaqat itself. And then in other sections, he's maybe quoting in 1-2 sentences or a paragraph, an entire page of Muwafaqat that he's summarizing. So it shows that the text was known and engaged with in Mauritania, from the 1700s onwards. So I'm looking at that textual component as well as the process of Islamic learning, and like you said, ijazas and transmission of texts and so forth, and how that all interacts. Yeah.
I think that sounds wonderful. The fact that the text was recited and learned, even though we don't have, for example, explicit ijazas that mention the text, for example.
Exactly. Yeah.
Still, there are quotations, which means that it was transmitted in a maybe kind of implicit, indirect way.
So perhaps that, and definitely his work was mentioned, and specific concepts that Shatibi is known for were mentioned by other scholars. So around 1800 or just before then, some of his specific arguments were used in their own text. So it shows that they were actually aware of his text and the main arguments he had within it. So even if there's no direct kind of silsila, as they say, regarding the transmission. So that's the kind of thing I'm looking at. And then after that, I'll be looking at how these two particular scholars conceptualized Shatibi's text and how they abridged it, and how they commented on it as well, to show, the different perspective on Maqasid compared to what we kind of know today.
And it will be very, very helpful in a few ways. One of them, for example, during those few hundred years, we will be able to see the transmissions and the kind of people who were citing. We might find Egyptian scholars who are part of the game. We might see Moroccans coming and going. It will give us a very good map of what kind of Mauritania was looking like in the broader intellectual.
So one of the texts that the most recent critical edition of Muwafaqat relies on is from around the 1680s, and it was part of a Sufi Zawiya called the Nasiriya Zawiya in Temavrout in southern Morocco. And they were specifically known for having a very specialist library of all these incredible texts, and anyone who was going to visit Morocco from Mauritania generally stopped there to visit it. So I mean, there's clear connections and possible transmissions happening there. So it's quite interesting. I mean, obviously it's only the first year of my thesis, so I've not uncovered everything yet, but it's promising.
Yeah, very exciting. Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right, we will continue, Dr. Aydoğan, after the colloquium with detail. All right, do you have any questions? Maybe let's ask the audience, if the audience have any questions. Do you have any questions to David?
I have a quick question. David, thank you so much for the presentation.
No problem, thank you.
My question is, recently it has been discussed that to add Hurriya or freedom as a Maqasid Sharia. So are you going to include that in your research or no?
So for the purpose of my PhD, I'm specifically limiting myself until about the early 1920s as a time limit, because after that explosion on Maqasid happened from the 50s onwards, I mean, there's all types of directions that I would have to integrate into my research. But I'm more concerned with how this work was used and conceptualized by scholars at that time. So I mean, there is discussion. I mean, we know from Al-Qarafi, who's Maliki side, that he discusses using human dignity as one of the maqsads of making 6 instead of 5. Others say, no, it's implicit already, so on and so forth. So there's already that debate, but I have not come across that in the text yet, but I imagine it's because this notion only developed in the last century, really, right?
More after modern period, more
exactly
begin from early 20th century. Yeah.
So because of my focus is a kind of early modern turn of the century, I don't really think this type of thing was specifically discussed. But obviously, I mean, there has been an explosion of Maqasid related works in Mauritania since the latter part of the 20th century until now as well. So if I ever expand to look into those, I'm sure I'll find discussion of it,
Yeah, within Maliki school, isn't it?
Yes,
modern discussions on Maqasid within Maliki school, Maliki jurists, maybe modern jurists, Maliki jurists.
Thank you so much for that.
Any other questions or comments? Any questions, any comments? All right. I think, David, Daud, thank you so much. I think it went well. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Also, you have got a good feedback. Thank you so much for
the questions and feedback.
You're welcome.
It looks that we need to leave now, aren't we?
Yes. Okay. Now, because if you don't have any presentation, please just only reviews and supervisors of David Drennan, please leave back, and also Zuleyha and Mehmet, as well. Others, please, now you can disconnect from Zoom. And looking forward to meeting you next time, next year, maybe during another research colloquium. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. As I said, just on the reviewers, Halim, Aydoğan, and supervisors, Züleyha and Mehmet. Thank you so much. Have a good night. Thank you, David. You are leaving as well. Yes, you are disconnecting as well. Yeah, all right. Just sorry, there is, let me disconnect, remove, yes, no. All right, Mehmet Hoca, Dr. Mehmet, because I am in David's supervision team, I cannot lead this in a private panel. If Dr. Mehmet Hoca, if you can please lead this private panel. I am Süleyman, Dr. Süleyman.
Part of the panel as a supervisor, but I guess you can't make the final decisions.
Yeah, maybe yeah.
Yeah,
You might be more objective than me because
Yeah.
yeah, I'm in his supervision team. Süleyman as well, Dr. Süleyman. Yeah.
Okay, well, so what were the main report's recommendations in terms of like, do we pass with amendments or do we pass or other